In this activity, we're going to evaluate the distribution of 3 different ecological communities at Oak Canyon. An ecological community is a geographic area where a mixed assemblage of species, plants and animals, tend to live together. So here is a shot showing the oak woodland. And the oak woodland is present mostly on the canyon floor, as you can see here, and it's dominated by coast live oak trees. As you can see here, this is the distribution, a map showing the distribution of the oak woodland on the canyon floor at Oak Canyon. The next community I want to evaluate is the coastal sage scrub. And the coastal sage scrub community tends to be on the south-facing slope, where I'm pointing to right there, the east-facing slope, and the west-facing slope at Oak Canyon. And it's dominated by coastal sagebrush that you can see on the left in this community, black sage, California buckwheat, laurel sumac, and sugar bush. As you can see, this is the map showing the distribution: south-facing slope, west-facing slope, east-facing slope at Oak Canyon. The third community I want to evaluate, and we didn't really get a very good look at it last time, that's the Chaparral. And Chaparral is mostly on the north-facing slope at Oak Canyon, and it's dominated by chaparral holly, poison oak, and scrub oak. So the question is, what causes this pattern? And the reality is that living things that are here at Oak Canyon, they organize themselves. It's not like they're planted here by gardeners, but there are several factors that influence this organization. There are physical, environmental circumstances of the location, for example, temperature and rainfall. And then also the biological traits of the living things that occupy these places. Let's look at physical characteristics first. So access to groundwater. Some places have more groundwater than others. Some places are sunnier. Exposure to sunlight. There's a difference in the exposure to sunlight, as we'll talk about. And also the temperature can be different. So some places are hotter, some places are cooler. So I created this map of Oak Canyon using the Far Cry 5 arcade editor because I wanted to explore some additional ideas with you on the distribution of plants at Oak Canyon. So let's take a walk. We're going to walk past the Nature Center. Off to the right is we can see we're in the oak woodland. So here's a nice grove of oak trees, and in the distance you can see the east-facing slope. To the left, and by the way, we are walking south. To the left is the ridge of the west-facing slope, and you can see there's Roadrunner Ridge up there. That's the hiking trail. And there's a bridge, and there's a little creek that's on the canyon floor. We can see the water here. So seems to be abundant groundwater on the canyon floor. And that creek is a good example of that. But I really want to get to the other canyon. the one that goes, it's oriented sort of in an east-west direction. Here's another look at the east-facing slope. And then we've got sort of the convergence of two creeks coming in here. Over on this side, and then one creek traveling down the east-west canyon floor here. I wanted to look at the slope that we haven't had a chance to look at, and that is the north-facing slope. And that's, we can kind of get a look at it here. That's the slope that I've designated as being the Chaparral. And you can see that it's pretty densely vegetated. There's some densely packed tall shrubs. That's the chaparral. That includes the chaparral holly. There's also poison oak in there, and also scrub oak that we haven't talked about yet. So that's the interesting question is, if we look over here, this is the south-facing slope, and then this is the north-facing slope, and you can see there's quite a bit of difference in the vegetation. Here it's lush and green with tall shrubs, but on the south-facing slope it's very sparsely vegetated, and what plants are there tend to be kind of low grasses and some other sort of small herbaceous plants. So the question is, you know, there seems to be a disparity in the distribution of groundwater, because this south-facing slope seems to be much drier than the north-facing slope. And that's despite the fact that when it rains, the rain falls equally on the north-facing slope and over here, and the south-facing slope, and also on the canyon floor. So we know that when it rains, certainly that water is going to run off the slopes, run downhill, and then collect on the canyon floor, and that's why we can see this creek on the canyon floor. So it's pretty easily understood why the bottom of the canyon floor, is pretty densely vegetated with a lot of coast live oak trees, because we can see that there's really abundant groundwater here, and trees do really well when there's abundant groundwater. But I'm still curious as to, well, all right, why so much vegetation on the north-facing slope and why so little vegetation on the south-facing slope? And let's go up there and take a look. So now we're up on the south-facing slope looking north, and I'm sorry, looking south. Yes, we're looking south as we're on the south-facing slope. There's the canyon floor, there's the north-facing slope over there, and I wanted to draw your attention to the location of the sun. So it's about midday, and the sun is in the southern sky. I'm looking south and I can see the sun there. I also want to point out, you can see that the north-facing slope has a great deal of shade on it, a lot of shadow, and that has to do with the location of the sun, as compared to the south-facing slope, has no shade at all because the sun is shining pretty much directly on it. So there seems to be a difference in the because of the different orientations of these slopes. It seems to be maybe that can influence the amount of water in the slopes. But I want to talk with you a little bit more about if this rain would just stop. I want to talk with you a little bit more about sort of how the sun goes through the sky, because even though it's midday and I can see that the sun is slightly in the southern sky, I want you to see that the sun is always in the southern sky during the course of the day. So the sun actually travels in an arc in the southern sky. And so I think what I'd like to do is get us sort of started back early in the morning Let's put the sun back. So now it's sunrise, and I'm looking south, and I want you to follow the sun as it rises up, and then it travels in an arc in the southern sky, and it is always in the southern sky. It's getting a little higher in the southern sky, but it's always in the southern sky. And then you can see the effect of that is that the north-facing slope always has shadows, and as the sun sets in the west. So I think that the location of the sun, let's bring it back up here. So the sun moves in an arc in the southern sky, and what that does is that increases the sunlight intensity that the south-facing slope gets. So this slope gets much more intense sunlight. You can see it's brighter here as compared to the north-facing slope, which seems the sun strikes it more obliquely at a low angle, creating a lot of shadow. And so that slope gets much less intense sunlight. And as you have more intense sunlight here, that means the temperature is going to be higher on the south-facing slope. And as the temperature is higher, then you're also going to get greater evaporation, which means this slope the groundwater in this slope is going to evaporate, and so the ground is going to be much drier here as compared to the north-facing slope, which is much cooler. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to go over and take a look. Get you a closer look at the Chaparral. So here we are now on the north-facing slope. That's where I'm looking at where we just were on the south-facing slope there on Roadrunner Ridge. So as you can see here, there's quite a bit of shade because I can't even see the sun here because the sun is so far in the southern sky. So it's shadier, it's cooler, and because it's cooler, then there's less water evaporation here. And that means that there's more water in the ground, and that greater amount of water can support a thicker, denser, greener vegetation. And so that helps explain why, despite that all areas of the canyon receive the same amount of rainfall, that water is distributed in different ways based on the topography. The bottom of the canyon floor gets most of the water as it drains to the bottom, but then the south-facing slope, much of that water is evaporated rapidly because of intense sunlight as compared to the north-facing slope that gets less intense sunlight because of its orientation toward the sun. So that helps explain the differences in the distribution of plants, at least as compared to the canyon floor, south-facing slope, and north-facing slope. So let's examine the physical components to this canyon system and see how the physical environment can be different and might help us understand why the distribution of plants also is different. So I made this diagram for you, and I want to go over this with you briefly. What it shows is we're looking at the canyon profile. So we're looking east, down the east-west canyon, where to the left is north, to the right is south. So this is the south-facing slope over here, and this is the north-facing slope over here, and then this is the canyon floor. The colors represent different things. Blue represents groundwater, and then the red or orangish indicates temperature. So let's look at groundwater first. The place where groundwater is most abundant, the biggest amount of groundwater available, is down on the canyon floor. And this is for two reasons. One, when the rain falls, the rain runoff travels down to the canyon floor and soaks in. And also because water on the ground tends to be pulled down. So this is the lowest part of the landscape, and so water would tend to accumulate down here on the bottom. Now, the smallest amount of groundwater that we find is up on the south-facing slope. And then the sort of medium amount of groundwater is on the north-facing slope. So why is that? Let's do this comparison here. Well, it has to do with the location of the sun, the angle of the sun. We just saw a little simulation on that. So the sun at Oak Canyon travels in an arc through the southern sky. And so the south-facing slope faces that direction and gets the most intense sunlight. As a result, it also has the highest temperatures as compared to the other two locations, and that means it has the highest evaporation rate, which means that it's driest. So we can understand the low amount of groundwater on the south-facing slope mostly as a consequence of the orientation of that slope toward the sun in the southern sky. The north-facing slope, yes, the north-facing slope has some real benefits in terms of temperature and sun exposure. So the temperature on the north-facing slope is actually the lowest. So this is the lowest temperature because it has the least intense sunlight. So it has the least intense sunlight exposure here because that sun it's sort of coming at a very, very low angle, and so there's lots of shade. It's not a direct sunlight exposure. So it has the least intense sunlight, the lowest temperatures compared to the other two locations, plus that means that they have the lowest evaporation rate. So that helps explain why there's more water in the ground over here as compared to the amount of water in the ground over on the south-facing slope. So now the canyon floor gets a sort of a medium amount of sunlight intensity, and it also falls sort of in between temperatures. It's cooler than the south-facing slope, but it's warmer than the north-facing slope. And so it has also, accordingly, it also has a sort of a medium evaporation rate. So that helps explain why, it helps at least explain that the physical conditions in terms of temperature, evaporation, and groundwater, how they're different, and that can help explain why the plants are distributed differently in the canyon. Okay, so the canyon, we've established that the Oak Canyon, the physical environment at Oak Canyon has variety. Generally, the canyon floor is a place where plants have greatest access to groundwater, and then the canyon walls are places where plants have less access to groundwater, especially the south-facing slope that is baked by the sun, and water gets evaporated by the sun's heat. So for the plants that live here, especially the ones on the canyon wall, the most stressful time of year for them is the end of summer. That is the time of year when there has been a long time without rain, because usually the rain comes during the cool winter months. So the end of summer, like August and September, there hasn't been rain for months, plus the temperatures are hottest during those months. So the greatest challenge facing the plants that live here, especially the ones on the canyon wall, is conserving water enough to help them live through this drought and through the end of summer. And that's what I wanted to point out here. I've got a little document here I wanted to go over with you. So what I'm showing here is just a short note on drought tolerance in plants, and I'm going to show you some examples, and I'm just going to kind of talk you through this a lot. So one of the features that we see in the plants that live in the coastal sage scrub and the chaparral ecological communities, one of the features or combined features that we see are ways that the plant reduces its exposure to sunlight. Um, and so that's what I'm listing here. You've got a few ways of doing that. You can have small leaves. For example, I've got the coastal sagebrush over here that expresses that very, very nicely. You could have light colored leaves as well. And also, this is coastal sagebrush. It also shows it's got very light colored leaves and vertically oriented leaves too. So here's coastal sagebrush, sort of showing some vertical orientation. Let me show you another one over here. This is chaparral holly or toyon. Now you can see how the leaves here are nicely vertically oriented. Not perfectly vertically oriented, but they have a sort of definitely a vertical orientation or a vertical component to their orientation. And how that's helpful is that it reduces sunlight exposure during midday when the sun is most intense. So the sun is most intense at noon. The sun is highest in the sky. With these leaves being vertically oriented, they are presenting a very, very much smaller surface area to that direct sunlight, and that reduces their heat uptake, and that reduces their temperature gain, that reduces their water evaporation. So vertical orientation is a good way to reduce exposure to the sun. Another way to deal with drought conditions, hot conditions, when there hasn't been any rain, is just simply lose your leaves. This happens not with, let me show you, this is black sage. This is something that happens with black sage. It's also something that happens with coastal sagebrush. It gets dry and it gets hot, and the leaves start to dry up. And remember, the leaves are the main site of water loss. So the leaves end up just, because they're not getting enough water from the roots, the leaves just dry up and die and then break off. And that removes the leaves from the plant, and that removes the main site of water loss. Because remember, the leaves have stomata in them, and the water evaporates out the stomata. So if the leaves just dry up and break off, then that reduces water loss because, yeah. And so, yeah, it's expensive. So what happens is the plants then become dormant or operate at a much reduced level during these dry months. And then as the winter rains return, then they leaf out again and go at it again. So dieback or drought deciduousness is a feature that is used by some, in this case, coastal sagebrush and also black sage. Water storage is a trait that is used by some plants. In particular, the plants I want to refer to are the cactus plants, and I have a picture of this is prickly pear cactus. We didn't really see much prickly pear cactus on the walkthrough that we did, the video walkthrough that I did before at Oak Canyon. But it is present there and it is a member of the coastal sage scrub community, and it's a succulent. So what you see here are not actually leaves. They look like leaves, but these are modified stems. The leaves have actually been converted into these spines, and we'll talk about spines in a little bit. So when the rains come in the wintertime, the cactuses, they have shallow roots that absorb that moisture and then store it inside the body of the plant, and that allows them to better manage their water resources. But in some cases, the plants that don't store the water, they have another way of trying to protect the water that's in the ground. And so they have what I call a low ground covering growth pattern, and we see that here with black sage. So they just spread out low over the ground, and they just cover the ground. And what that does is it reduces sunlight hitting the ground, so it shades the ground. And then secondly, it keeps the wind off of the ground too, and because wind can be a very, very powerful force of evaporation. If you think about heat and moving air, think about a hair dryer, think about a clothes dryer. That's how those devices work, is they blow moving hot air through your hair, and that dries out, that carries the water away from your hair. So heat and wind are very, very powerful drying forces. And growing low, covering the ground, keeping the wind away, because the wind would hit that plant and then be diverted over the top of it, and that keeps the wind from moving across the soil, because that's where the moisture is. And so that's a real benefit there. Just divert the wind and also block the sun, shade the soil. Now some plants have spine-tipped leaves, and this gets a little bit more complicated, but let me show you a picture. Here, this is coast live oak, and there's a bunch of other plants in the coastal sage scrub and chaparral that have spines. The spines are these little pokey things on the edge of the leaf. And what those do is they act as like heat radiators. What they do is or cooling fins. You know, if you think about a motorcycle engine, they've got these sort of fins, these little metal slats that are arrayed in parallel with each other. Or if you think about the little fins in a radiator on a car, whenever you have these sort of structures, they generally can be associated with the exchange. In this case, the exchange is heat. So at midday, these leaves might get to be 20 or 30 degrees hotter than the surrounding air. So they might be 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the hot, sunny day. Meanwhile, the air temperature around might only be 90 degrees. So there's a big 30-degree temperature difference. So heat always travels from high temperature to low temperature. So if the leaf has a high temperature, 120 degrees, the air has 90 degrees in temperature, then heat is going to flow from, as the air comes by, then heat is going to flow from the leaf to the air. And what these fins do is that they increase the surface area contact that the leaf has with the air, and that speeds up the removal of heat from the leaf to the air, and that helps it to reduce its temperature gain. And that helps to reduce its evaporation and helps it to conserve water. Some plants have very deep roots. Example of plant with deep roots would be, I'm going to go back here to Chaparral holly. They have very deep roots, and what those roots do is that they can get down deeper and deeper to moisture that tends to be more permanent. That doesn't fluctuate from season to season. Other plants that have deep roots, what do I have here on this little chart? I'll talk about that in a little bit. But other plants that have deep roots are coast live oak, chaparral holly that I'm showing here, scrub oak, which I don't have a picture of and we didn't see in our previous little walkthrough, and then also laurel sumac and sugar bush, which is not listed on this table. So the deep roots allow the plant to sort of not be as vulnerable to seasonal water fluctuations in the ground, because that deep water down below tends to be more of a permanent kind of a thing. So that takes me to this summary table, and let me just go through this really quickly with you, because I'm going to highlight some of the individual plants, and I'm just going to briefly go through it with you. So what I'm showing here is on the left, there's a column of several plants that I wanted to feature in this little discussion. And then several of the features, the traits, the water conserving, the drought tolerant features that I've just gotten through talking about. And to show sort of the combinations, what combinations of features, these drought tolerant features that some of these plants have. So coast live oak, we saw has small leaves. Also, we saw has spine-tipped leaves, and it also has very, very deep roots. These are not really super serious water conservation features, but they do help. And so the deep roots is probably the most useful feature for the coast live oak is it can get down there. As you see, most of the coast live oaks are on the canyon floor, and they can get those roots down into the base of the canyon and get at that deep groundwater that accumulates there. Chaparral holly, that's what I'm showing here, has a combination of small leaves, and the leaves are spine-tipped. You really can't see that here, but the leaves do have little spines on them, plus they also have deep roots. Scrub oaks, same as it's a shrubby plant, kind of similar to chaparral holly, and has the same combination of features. Now, in the coastal sage scrub community, and by the way, I've organized this table based on the ecological community that these plants belong to. So coast live oak belongs to the oak woodland, chaparral holly, scrub oak, and poison oak, which I skipped completely because, look, it has nothing. Anyway, these three belong to the chaparral, which is on the north-facing slope. So let me go back and talk about poison oak. Notice poison oak has nothing. There's no drought-tolerating feature. And where we find poison oak is anywhere where it's shady. Anywhere where it's shady, we find poison oak. But it's not particularly drought-tolerant. It is able to cope there, mostly because we find it's very particular in where it lives. And it is always in places that never get sun. So it's always in a shady place. And the shade is being provided by other plants around it, like the coast live oak and the chaparral holly. All right, in the coastal sage scrub community, I've listed several plants here, and we see more drought-tolerant features. Coastal sagebrush has got small leaves. They're light in color. They tend to reflect the sunlight. They tend to have some vertical orientation. They are drought deciduous, meaning they'll lose their leaves during times of drought. And then they also have a bit of sort of a low encrusting growth that helps to shade the ground around it and divert the wind away from the moisture-containing soil. Black sage, it's also small leaves, and it is drought deciduous. They will lose their leaves at the end of summer. And then they also, we saw a little picture of them previously just now, that they have this low encrusting growth pattern. California buckwheat, also small leaves. They are drought deciduous. They will lose their leaves at the end of summer, and then they also encrust the ground. Laurel sumac, small leaves, and they have a little bit of a vertical orientation because the leaves, remember, are on the laurel sumac are bent back or bent and folded like little taco shells. So what that does is it's for each of the sides of the leaf, they tend to be folded up, and that in that way, then they create this sort of a vertical orientation. And they also have, laurel sumac also has deep roots. Prickly pear cactus, I'm showing here, has light colored leaves. These are really pads or modified stems, but we can think of them operationally as leaves. Anyway, they're light in color. They also are vertically oriented, right? So where's my puncha here? See, they tend to have a high vertical orientation. They store water, and this is the only plant in the group here that I'm showing that really stores water. They have this low encrusting growth that you can see there, and then they've got a lot of spines. And the spines can contribute to the dispersal of heat and stuff. Okay, so that explains a little bit about as we have a canyon that has pretty stressful environmental circumstances up on the canyon wall, especially on the south-facing slope. We see that there are biological features, there are traits in the plants that live in these places, on these canyon walls. They have certain traits that allow them to be better at conserving water, and that gives them a chance to get through the end of summer. And as the next winter rains come, they produce new leaves, produce flowers, and then the cycle repeats. So Oak Canyon is we can see has a diversity of physical environmental circumstances, and then we also see that it has the plants that live there have a variety of biological traits that allow them to cope with this variety of physical circumstances.